Mr. Noisy by Roger Hengers. Mr. Noisy was very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy were reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place. Can you hear it 100 miles away? For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But achoo, when Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next county. So far away, you can hear him. Now this story starts with Mr. Noisy asleep in bed, in his room, in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring. Anybody snoring? And as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, this is a snore worth hearing. It sounds like a herd of running elephants than a snore. That's very loud. You see him sleeping in his bed. Got his shoes right there. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Wow, that is loud. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so too did, and so, sorry that I'm having a problem with this. It's not how I would put it, but we'll read it as the book says. And so too did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. So his alarm clock was so loud that it woke up the whole town. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! There's his door. Got his shoes on. He's going shopping. The door wobbled. See how it's moving? The house wobbled. The whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high above Wobbletown wobbled. Wow. Mr. Noisy is noisy. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, 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 clump. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, boomed Mr. Noisy to Miss Crumb, the baker. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. See, she doesn't quite know what to think about all that noise, all the clump, 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 and I'd like a loaf of bread. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clomp, clomp, clomp. He walked into the butcher shop. Crashed went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. He said, I'd like a piece of meat. Okay. Afterward, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a little smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you have the answer. I wonder what they come up with. Let's find out. The following day, Mr. Noisy again went down to Wobbletown to shop. Clomp, clomp, clomp. So that's the noise of his shoes. It goes clomp, clomp, clomp. Look at the worm down here. Well, what is going on? He went into Mrs. Clump's shop. "I'd like a loaf of bread," he boomed. "Sorry, what did you say?" asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. "I'd like a loaf of bread," Mr. Noisy shouted. "Sorry," said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. "Can you speak up, please?" "I'd like a loaf of bread," roared Mr. Noisy. "Can't hear you," replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. "I'd like a piece of meat," Mr. Noisy boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. "I'd like a piece of meat," Mr. Noisy shouted. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon. "I said I'd like a piece of meat," roared Mr. Noisy. "Pardon?" said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out and went home and went to bed hungry. Okay, he's pretty sad. The next day, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crump's shop. "I'd like a loaf of bread," he boomed. "A what?" asked Mrs. Crump. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the top of his voice, "A loaf of—" and then he stopped. And then he thought. And then he said quietly, "I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crump." Mrs. Crump smiled. "Certainly," she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. "I'd like a piece of meat," he boomed. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon. "Yes, I did," shouted Mr. Noisy at the very top of his voice. "I said I'd like a—" and then he stopped. And then he thought. And then he said quietly, "I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon." Mr. Bacon smiled. "My pleasure," he said. See, Mr. Bacon's very happy. So carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off for home up the hill. Clomp, clomp, clomp. There's that worm again, but he's smiling this time. Then he stopped. Then he thought. And then, do you know what he did? He tiptoed. He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. He's tiptoeing by the worm. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door, and then he stopped. And then he thought. And then, do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside, and then he shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before either. And they were fun too. And do you know something? Mr. Noisy isn't as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has even learned how to